Peace, my family, and welcome back to all those coming out at a good cocoon for the first time. Welcome. This your girl, the butterfly, and we about to take off. Let's fly. Just want to send you all that good healing energy your way. Peace, love, happiness, harmony, and abundance. Hope you guys are out there keeping your mind right in that good mind. How y'all feeling? Hope you guys most definitely move on up. That's right, in your higher nature family, and most definitely cleansing, because if you don't know, now you know. Oh yes, we must cleanse. Cleansing that lower nature, those lower frequency energies family. Oh yes, we're out here. All right. I'm going to be doing, this is part 2 of the breaking of the spell, along with this question of what is the difference between a Hebrew and a Jew, right? And this is going to be a part 2, so if you don't know what I'm speaking on and you want to know more, it's going to be very good for you to go and check out the part 1 so you can begin to piece it all together, because everything that our master teacher writes is for a reason, for you to get a better understanding of all things, right? So with that being said, let's get to it. This is part 2, and it says Hebrew is a variant of the word Gilgabor, sometimes spelled Gilgabor or Gilbero or Gilbero, a fire worshipper, a true star's fire, ether fire, the sun of Earth's solar system, is one of the true stars. There were Ethiopians, Hebrews too, many woolly hair people who were Hebrews. However, since the Jews have possessed the term, however, the Jews have possessed the term Jew for themselves, okay? Let them have it, alright? Don't try to reclaim it, okay? Because the woolly haired people, among other Hebrews, were only being used anyway. Moreover, the original Hebrew writers of the books of the Bible were Nubians and Phoenicians, being used by the moon god Dina to reprove the Canaanites concerning what they were doing to darker peoples. But the moon god knew that the Canaanites would persecute and kill the reprovers. But there was a part of the game the moon was playing to keep the moon cycle in progress and the Canaanites in power. In light of the previous paragraph, you can easily see that the people in bondage and captivity in the Bible were darker peoples, especially Phoenicians and Nubians. It is written that the Hebrews lost their tribal identities around 400 or 500 BC, but there were never any 12 tribes of Hebrews in the first place. There were Chaldeans family who crossed over, and because of that were called Hebrews. The Hebrews who began losing their identity around that time were not the Caucasians, the Canaanites of Judaism, but the Phoenicians, because around that time is when the Canaanites started their cruel persecution and suppression against the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians started going right wherever they could to escape those Afro cities and brutalities. So by 300 or 400 BC, around the time the last book of the Old Testament, the Old Testament is supposed to have been written, there was hardly any need for a prophet because the Phoenicians were so well scattered. However, there were various writings between 400 BC and 1 BC by priests and prophets that should be part of the Old Testament, the Old Testimonies, but are not, because they tell of the cruel persecutions in the Afro cities that preceded the appearance of Jesus. The Old Testament and testimonies of people who came along and they studied the 2 tablets, the Torah, meaning law, right? From the Aramaic Hebrew root word, Yahweh, that were given to Moses at Sarabad, El Chaddim, the temple of Hagar, who was the goddess Hathor, stood. And these tablets are created by Enki and Zum by taking portions of the 7 holy tablets, the tablets of destiny of the Elohim, and combined them with the Gilgamesh epics, which talks about the great indulge. If you look at the 2 tablets that Moses held, right, you will see they begin with Hebrew letter, Aleph, and end with the Hebrew letter Yod, symbolizing the 10 commandments, of which all real studiers of the Torah know is not 10, okay, but 613 commandments. The Aleph is symbolic of the name of the Elohim. In the first chapter of Genesis, which uses only the name Elohim, and the Yod is symbolic of the name Yahshua of the second chapter of Genesis, okay, which only the name Yahshua Elohim. This, along with laws of the Levite priests who were the students of the serpent Leviathan, the Levitical laws, which are the laws of Satan, come from the laws of the code of Hammurabi, meaning rabbis, masters of Ham. Ham was the father of Canaan, and they are the same laws that are made and enforced by the Canaanites that govern the world. And it goes on to say, the Kemarians and the Kahamran are the black-robed priests of different idols. They were appointed by the kings of Judah to conduct worship in high places, and the original significance of the verb form was to be black, and explained the use of the noun by asserting that the Idols priests wore black garments. Okay, today it represents the one that becomes emotional behind the pulpit when he dances around the hole trying to fire up the audience. The word kamor, which means to grow warm, tender, or to grow hot, black, dark, gloomy. It is also means idolatrous, priests, and it is the root of Kal Mariam, and that is parallel to the root word Kaham, meaning black or hot, heat, which comes right to Ham, son of Noah, and the father of Canaan, father of the Canaanites. The enforcers of the code of laws. It's clear to see the laws you are forced to adhere to are made up, written, and enforced by pagan worshippers of Baal, by the way of Ham's son's Canaan. When you look at the privative, the Kamon, you will find that it means sun pillar, and it's used in idolatrous worship and often as the solar pale. The priests of Bel were called the Chemarim, and was called the priest of Bel, and wrote the history of the world on the sun pillars of the ancient Syria temples. Those were the sun pillars in the pagan Canaanites that had dedicated to the solar disk, and the lineage leading directly from Adam and through Cain down to this day. Sanchoniathon claimed that he was standing in the lineage leading directly from Adam and through Cain down to this day, and he claimed that Bel worship was descended from Cain. So it goes on to say, from the definitions used or being used, you will find that Shemarim were the priests of Bel who wore black robes, and this is the garb most wear by the priests and the ministers of today. These men wore these robes in contrast to the white robes ordained by Yahshua the Elohim to wear in the temple. Yahshua Elohim said, wear white robes. Okay? This is why the Catholic Church and the Christian ministers, as well as the Jewish rabbis, all wore black, when in the scriptures it clearly tells them that they should be wearing white robes. The Levite priests were responsible for converting the children back to the worship of the bull god, the Torah, who is in the ancient Sumerian Egypt would be the goddess Hathor. Exodus 32, 1-6. By deceiving Moses and his brother Aaron, the high priest, from the knowledge of all this, along with the testimonies of other people, they yielded the rest of the Old Testament, like Ezekiel, who tried to tell about the Elohim, and they further distorted the Bible by the Talmud and the Mishnah. And the darker people of the regions who were controlled by the Canaanites were forced to accept the Canaanites' new version of Christianity, Matthew 23:15, which came out of the Alexandria schools of Egypt around 300 BC. It was mixed with the Hindu doctrine because it is partly based on the belief in reincarnation and God incarnated into flesh. Okay? So, it goes on to say, the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament from which came the Latin and the English versions, were collected after Alexander the Great. The Greek marched unopposed into Egypt and northern Africa around 333 BC, and the Septuagint was published several decades later around 300 BC. And this means that the so-called Jews did not have an organized Bible until the Greek version was compiled, for they had been using various scrolls and parchments for their religious rituals and rites. Moreover, the Jews were well schooled in the Kabbalah, system, okay? And it's a system, right? The Kabbalah system, a system of mystery, words, and candles, steam, the secret know-hows, and passed down orally from father to son, to mother to daughter, but never put in writings. And their book of devil worship, okay? There have been many versions or reversions of the Septuagint, the Old Testament, and since its compulsion and publication around 300 BC, the 7 and 72 ministries from Jerusalem, those were supposed to be the ones who compelled the Old Testament, are the people who were persuaded to change the writings to suit their purposes of Caucasian rulers, okay? At the time of the advent of Jesus, apparently the Jews had not yet claimed the Ethiopian and Phoenician bondage and captives of the Old Testament as their own, as evidenced by this written statement in John 8:33. And it reads, they answer Yahshua, and we are Abraham's sperm, and was never in slavery to any man. So how do you make this speech? You will become free. Alright? So it goes on to say, Jews and the other Canaanites, if given the opportunity in the future, will also claim that the enslavement of American Negroes as enslavement of the Canaanites, as Jews claim the enslavement of the Egyptians as the enslavement of Jews. Moreover, in reading the Bible, people make this mistake of concentrating too much on what God or Jesus is supposed to have said, and too little emphasis on the other side of the argument. And through this error, people miss valuable information and eye-opening knowledge, which disapproves many biblical and Caucasian claims, not only by words, but also by what actually took place before, then by what took place since, and what is taking place now. Okay? In other words, note that the unreligious history does not coincide with those claims, and that the Caucasians are still doing today what they did then, which was claiming one thing and then doing another. This makes them history's best known hypocrites and liars. So there is a time span of 300 and 400 years between the Old and the New Testament, because the Hebrews and the Phoenicians were too scattered, and therefore were too little need for a prophet. Too after the Septuagint and the Old Testament was compiled and published around 300 BC. And any biblical writings in BC after the King James Version would be an unauthorized edition, such as Pell and the Dragon, the Wise and the Wisdom of Jesus, and the Maccabees, and the Book of Barnabas, etc. And there were many words and works that went on between 400 BC and 1 BC, which the Canaanites did not want known, such as the persecutions in the Afro cities the Canaanites used to eliminate Egyptian pantheism before they finished it off around the time of Jesus. When the New Testament was compelled, when the two New Testament was compelled, it began with God coming down to save the people, which is based on Genesis chapter 2. The Greeks, who mixed in with Idris' wife, Esau, son of Jacob, had to create their own gods, and they took their seed and gave them a doctrine which became Christianity, an offshoot of Hinduism. The books of Ezekiel and Daniel of the Old Testament were used to compile the book of Revelation, and they took other books from the Old Testament and created a Messiah image and God incarnated into flesh concept. They took this by the Gentiles who incorporated their own doctrine, which double enforced the spell of Enki cast by Zoom. Okay? So that right there was the end of his answer. Okay? Now, just because I am reading these answers to you, right? The right knowledge of these answers. This is for you to also, if you are interested and you want to know more and you want to read this yourself, which is so much encouraged for you to do so, check it out. It is on a channel just for you, to do your self-study. And this is just to spark your interest. Maybe you really want to know the real stories of what happened and you want to know more. This is for you. Just let me know in the comment section. I'll be happy to get you what you need, get you this book. All right? So, because you're going to need it on this journey to break the spell. Alright? So, for now, I'm going to leave it at that. Again, my family, I want y'all all to know that you are loved so much beyond this world. Oh, yes, and in it. Begin to spread that love, family. 1, 2, 8, not third. Be that peace that you seek. Release our master teacher, Dr. Malachi Z. L. family. Peace, shalom, my divine love, family. And why do? Because it is all love.